I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen bee.
The monarchy did not tremble because of a public speech, a balcony appearance, or a ceremonial mistake. It trembled because King Charles made a private decision with public consequences, and Queen Camilla felt the ground shift beneath her. In one decisive order, the king stripped her of key internal authority and elevated William as the central royal voice on family governance, palace access, and future-facing decisions. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles read the final page twice before he touched the pen, and in that pause, the whole palace seemed to hold its breath. The formal private order, a written royal instruction used inside the household to define who may approve sensitive decisions, did not remove Camilla's title, but it cut into the power she had exercised behind closed doors. The queen consort would no longer hold authority over selected palace household decisions, ceremonial influence, or advisory access connected to the prince's future role. This mattered because the palace is not ruled only by crowns and speeches. It is shaped by who controls rooms, schedules, invitations, briefings, and the quiet permissions that decide who stands close to power. Charles knew that signing the order would wound her. He also knew that refusing to sign it would leave William exposed to a divided command at the very moment the monarchy needed certainty. William was not being crowned early, and that distinction mattered. Succession preparation, the careful planning for how the next monarch is trained, briefed, and positioned before the throne passes, was now moving into his hands with a force no one could ignore. The prince became the decisive senior figure on family discipline, palace access, and public-facing royal stability. He did not ask for celebration. He did not need applause. His new authority arrived like a weight placed across his shoulders, because every step forward for him would feel, to Camilla, like a door closing in her face. Camilla received the news in a private sitting room and went still. She did not misunderstand the order. She understood it too well. The clause that struck deepest required William's approval before she could intervene in certain family decisions tied to royal appearances, heirlooms, and palace access. A senior aide folded the document into a red dispatch folder, the official case used to carry confidential papers between royal offices, and the quietness of that gesture made the decision feel more dangerous than any public scandal. Charles had not simply changed procedure, he had changed the balance of trust, and the first person he now had to face was not the public, not the courtiers, and not even William. It was Camilla, whose reaction would turn a private decision into an emotional confrontation. But before the queen consort could challenge the order, the palace had to reckon with the three people whose lives had just been rearranged by one signature. Every royal crisis has a public face, but this one had three private wounds. Charles carried the burden of a king who believed he had waited too long. Camilla carried the humiliation of a woman who thought her place was finally secure. William carried the pressure of a future monarch suddenly pulled closer to the center of power, knowing that every step forward would look like a betrayal to someone. Charles stood by the window after the order was delivered, one hand fixed on the back of a chair, his face tight with the kind of silence that hurts more than anger. The crown, the living symbol of royal duty and national continuity, demanded clarity, but his heart still understood the cost. This was not framed as punishment against Camilla. It was framed as protection for the institution, because a divided palace could not guide a future king while private influence pulled against public duty. The monarch knew why it mattered. If authority remained blurred, every future decision could become a battlefield before it ever reached the public. Camilla felt the wound before anyone explained the details. She had not lost a title, but she had lost something more personal: the quiet right to be heard first, to shape the room before others entered it, to move through palace decisions with the confidence of someone who belonged at the center. The queen consort understood that authority inside a royal household is not always announced. Sometimes it lives in who receives the briefing, who controls the guest list, who speaks to the king before a final answer is given. Now that power had been cut away, and she felt personally rejected, not simply reduced. William learned his new position with no sign of triumph. The heir, the person next in line to the throne, was now being pulled closer to command, because the palace could see the future approaching faster than anyone wanted to admit. The prince would receive private briefings once filtered through Charles and Camilla, and that changed the internal balance instantly. A courtier watched his reaction, expecting relief, perhaps even pride. Instead, William asked only one careful question. Had Camilla been told yet? That question revealed everything. He knew the order strengthened him, but he also knew it wounded her. The palace felt the pressure tighten around all three of them. Charles had chosen duty over comfort. Camilla had discovered that years of influence could be narrowed by one signature. William had gained authority that felt less like victory and more like warning, and the most dangerous truth was still hidden beneath the surface. This order had not appeared from nowhere. It had been born from one private incident the palace had tried to bury. And when that hidden incident is finally traced back, one private ceremony emerges, as the moment that made Charles decide there could be no turning back. The palace could survive tension, whispered rivalry, and cold dinners behind closed doors. What it could not survive was the moment Charles realized a line had been crossed in front of the very people meant to protect the monarchy. The trigger was not a rumor or a passing disagreement. It was the private Windsor succession briefing, where Camilla challenged William's role before senior aides and left the room frozen. Charles had entered that meeting expecting order, not confrontation. The Windsor succession briefing, a private planning session where senior palace figures discuss future royal duties, ceremonies, and access around the next monarch, was supposed to be controlled, careful, and calm. It mattered, because these meetings decide who is prepared for power before the public ever sees the shift. It also mattered because William's future role was no longer distant. The prince was being prepared for command, and every person around that table knew the monarchy could not afford confusion when the next chapter arrived. Camilla spoke with the confidence of someone who believed she still had the right to shape the answer. The queen consort objected to William receiving final review authority over future ceremonial planning and family access decisions, and the room tightened around her words. She argued that the prince was being advanced too quickly, that too much authority was moving toward him before the crown itself had passed. William stayed silent, but his jaw tightened. He knew that if he answered sharply, he would look ambitious. If he stayed quiet, he would look wounded. So he chose silence, and that silence cut deeper than any argument. Charles watched the exchange and felt something collapse inside him. The king did not see a routine disagreement anymore. He saw Camilla challenging the heir's future authority in front of the very aides expected to protect that future. A senior aide later placed a written account of the meeting into the monarch's private file, and that documented account became the first time her resistance was treated as a constitutional concern inside the household. A constitutional concern simply means an issue serious enough to affect how royal authority is protected and passed on. That changed everything. Camilla's most damaging words came at the end. She said William should not be allowed to inherit command before he inherits the crown. The sentence did not fade when the meeting ended. It followed Charles through the night. It turned a family wound into a royal warning. By morning, the monarch was no longer thinking like a husband trying to calm tension. He was thinking like a king who believed hesitation had become dangerous. Once Charles stopped seeing the conflict as a family disagreement, the confrontation with Camilla became inevitable. When Camilla entered the private room, she did not ask whether the order was real. She already knew. What she wanted was the one thing Charles could no longer give her: reversal. The king stood near the desk, the signed folder between them like a sealed verdict. For a few seconds, neither moved. Then she asked him how long he had been planning to take her power away. Camilla did not raise her voice at first. That made the moment colder. The private order, a signed instruction used inside the royal household to change who controls sensitive decisions, had already done its damage before she entered. It mattered, because this was not a public title being removed. It was practical authority, access, approval, influence, and the quiet power to shape decisions before anyone else saw them. The queen consort still had her position, but the machinery behind that position had been cut back. Charles understood the difference, and so did she. Camilla pushed back the chair with a sharp motion, and the sound broke the silence between them. She demanded to know why William's authority now stood above hers in family matters, why the prince could approve decisions she once helped shape, and why the king had let her discover the truth after the document was already prepared. Her anger was not only about power, it was about humiliation. She had spent years believing her place beside Charles meant trust, not permission. Now the queen consort felt that trust had been replaced by a rule written in black ink. Charles answered quietly, but the softness did not make it merciful. He told Camilla the monarchy could not afford divided command when the future king was already carrying public expectation. The king said William's role had to be protected before uncertainty hardened into crisis. That mattered because the palace could survive private pain, but it could not survive two centers of influence pulling against the air. The monarch did not call it punishment, he called it clarity. To her, it sounded like exile from the rooms where power actually lived. Camilla saw the truth land before Charles fully said it. The order had been prepared before she was warned. The decision had crossed the emotional line before the conversation began. Then the king revealed what had changed everything: the Windsor succession briefing. Her words there, once spoken in anger, had become the evidence against her. She understood then that the sentence about William not inheriting command before the crown had followed Charles into the night and returned as a signed verdict. The confrontation ended without forgiveness. Charles opened the door and asked for William to be brought in next. And when William steps into the same room, the crisis stops being about what Camilla lost and becomes about what he is now expected to carry. William did not enter like a victor. He entered like a man who understood that power can arrive dressed as punishment. Charles did not offer congratulations, and the prince did not ask for them. Between father and son lay a folder that had already wounded one marriage and altered the palace chain of command. The question was no longer whether William would rise. The question was whether he could rise without appearing to betray. Charles looked at his son and made the first thing clear. This was not a reward. The king spoke with the heavy calm of a man who had already paid for the decision in private pain. William's elevation, his rise into stronger decision-making power before becoming monarch, gave him decisive advisory control over succession preparation, family access protocols, and future ceremonial planning. That mattered because succession preparation is not just about waiting for the throne. It is about training the future king to protect the institution before crisis decides the timing for him. It also mattered because palace access controls who enters sensitive rooms, who receives private briefings, and who can shape family decisions before they become public wounds. William absorbed every word without pride. The prince knew Camilla would not see this as stability. She would see it as humiliation wrapped in procedure. Charles told him the monarchy needed one clear center of gravity, and the future king had to stand closer to that center now, not later. The king did not say Camilla had become a danger. He did not need to. The folder had already said enough. William listened with quiet resolve, but the silence on his face carried one painful truth. Authority had arrived through someone else's loss. William then asked the question that changed the room. Had Catherine been informed? The Princess of Wales, his wife and future queen consort, meaning the spouse expected to stand beside the next monarch, mattered, because this decision would touch their household too. The prince was not thinking first of influence, applause, or control. He was thinking of the emotional shock that would travel through his own family once the palace understood what had changed. Charles saw that and softened for a moment, because his son had not reached for power. He had reached for protection. Charles then disclosed the permanent shift. Certain palace briefings would now bypass Camilla entirely and go straight to William. The king said it plainly, and the words landed like a locked door. A private secretary watched as the prince signed an acknowledgement note, and his hand paused before the final stroke. That pause said what no speech could. William understood that history was closing around him, and once the palace staff learned the order, loyalty would begin to divide. By the next morning, the order has moved beyond one room, and the first signs of fallout begin to show in faces, whispers, and locked doors. The palace did not erupt. That was what made it worse. No shouting filled the corridors. No announcement rang through the gates. No public statement explained what had changed. Yet everyone could feel it. A door that once opened for Camilla remained closed. A briefing that once passed through her office went elsewhere. And in that silence, the Queen Consort understood that authority can vanish before anyone dares say it aloud. Camilla sat alone after the aide finished speaking, and her expression hardened before she answered. The chain of command, the order showing who has approval power inside the royal household, had shifted in a way no one could mistake. Briefings that once moved through her office were redirected to William. Approvals once marked for her review were removed. This mattered because palace power often lives in routine. Schedules, access notes, ceremonial planning, and family coordination may sound small, but together they decide who influences the king, who protects the heir, and who quietly shapes the story before the public ever hears it. William received the redirected briefing with visible hesitation. The prince did not open it at once, because every page inside confirmed the same painful truth. Authority had been taken from Camilla and placed with him. He knew the palace would read his silence however it wished. If he moved quickly, he would look eager. If he delayed, he would look weak. So he paused, then opened the folder with the careful control of a man trying not to turn someone else's humiliation into his own advancement. The future king understood why the change mattered. A divided household could not prepare a stable reign, and uncertainty around family access could become public chaos at any moment. Charles had gone further than anyone first realized. A trusted aide discovered, through a documented internal review note, that the king had also authorized a review of past decisions influenced by Camilla. That discovery changed the mood instantly. The review was not just a check of paperwork, it was a sign that the monarch wanted to understand how deep her influence had gone. The Queen Consort was not only being limited in the present, her past role was being measured, recorded, and possibly redefined. The palace felt loyalty split without anyone saying the word. Some staff moved toward William because the new order demanded it. Others watched Camilla with sympathy, knowing the loss was both practical and personal. Charles had created clarity, but clarity had a cost. His decision now touched every room, every note, every glance. And as the machinery changed around them, the cold royal order demanded something warmer and harder. A father and son facing each other without aides, titles, or protection. And in that private father and son meeting, the monarchy's coldest decision becomes painfully human. There were no courtiers in the room when Charles finally sat across from William. No secretaries, no red folders moving between hands. Just a father who had wounded his wife to protect the crown, and a son who had been handed authority he never publicly sought. For the first time since the order was signed, the palace machinery disappeared, and what remained was heavier than protocol. Family, guilt, duty, and inheritance. Charles looked older in that silence, not weaker, but burdened. The crown, the symbol of royal duty, public trust, and the line of rule, had demanded a choice he could no longer delay. This mattered because the monarchy cannot survive on affection alone. It needs one clear path when pressure rises, and it needs the future king ready before the storm arrives. The king admitted, in a private conversation with no aides present, that he had waited too long to stop the internal drift. He had allowed influence, loyalty, and marriage to blur the lines around William's future command. Now the correction had come late, and lateness had made it cruel. William did not answer quickly. The prince saw regret in his father, not triumph. That changed everything. His new authority, the right to guide sensitive decisions before they reach public view, could become a weapon if he used it carelessly. It could humiliate Camilla, divide the household, and make him look hungry for power. But it could also steady the monarchy if he used it with restraint. That was why this meeting mattered. William was no longer deciding whether to accept authority. He was deciding what kind of man he would be while holding it. Charles then revealed the fear he had carried in private. The king said he believed the crown could one day be pulled between competing loyalties unless the line of command was clarified now. William listened, and the words settled heavily between them. He understood that his father had not signed the order to win an argument with Camilla. He had signed it because hesitation had begun to look more dangerous than heartbreak. The monarch had chosen pain now to prevent collapse later. William finally spoke with quiet resolve. He said he would not use the new authority to punish or embarrass Camilla. Every decision under his role had to be written, accountable, and never used as private revenge. That condition changed the meaning of the order. It turned a personal blow into a governing principle. Charles had handed him power, but the prince answered with limits. And as that private promise took shape behind closed doors, the outside world began to learn that something inside the palace had shifted. But once the story reaches beyond palace walls, the nation sees one image that captures the entire rupture. By sunrise, the palace could no longer contain the shape of what had happened. The public did not have the full order, but it had enough. One front page turned private tension into national judgment. A stark photograph of Charles, Camilla, and William from a past ceremony, with the headline declaring, "King backs the heir." In that single image, Britain saw a marriage wounded, a son elevated, and a monarchy choosing its future. Camilla saw the front page at breakfast and folded it slowly. She did not throw it aside. She did not call for anyone. The headline had already done what the order began. "King backs the heir" turned a private palace decision into a national symbol. And that mattered, because the public rarely sees the machinery of royal power until something breaks through the curtain. The internal realignment, a shift in who holds influence inside the royal household without changing who sits on the throne, was now being discussed as a historic moment. It was not a change of reign. Charles was still king. But influence had moved, and everyone could see where it had gone. William watched the morning broadcast with visible discomfort. The presenter called him the crown's active center of gravity, and the phrase sounded heavier than praise. The crown, in this context, meant not just the monarch, but the whole system of duty, power, tradition, and public trust built around the throne. The prince knew why the words mattered. If the country believed he had risen because Camilla had fallen, his authority would begin under a shadow. If the country understood that Charles had acted to protect stability, then the future king could step forward without looking like he had pushed anyone aside. Charles kept the palace response deliberately brief. The statement confirmed his confidence in William's expanding responsibilities, but it did not directly name Camilla's reduced role. That silence was careful, and it was cruel in its own way. It protected the queen consort from a harsher public sentence, but it also confirmed that the palace would not deny the shift. Camilla understood that too. Her private loss had become public knowledge, even if no one said the sharpest words aloud. A small crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace, not in anger, but in stunned curiosity. People held up phones, as if waiting for a balcony that never opened. Broadcasters repeated the same image: Charles in the center, Camilla beside him, William close enough to suggest what came next. The monarchy had offered no drama, yet the nation felt the rupture. The public had its image, the palace had its statement, and now only the emotional verdict remained. What did this decision truly cost? To understand the meaning of the order, the story must return to the people it changed most: Charles, Camilla, and William. In the end, the order was not only about authority, it was about the moment a king accepted that love could not be allowed to blur the line of succession, and a queen consort discovered that influence without trust can disappear in a single signature. William did not seize the future. Charles handed it to him early, carefully, and painfully, because the monarchy had reached a point where hesitation was more dangerous than heartbreak. Charles carried the silence that followed, like a private punishment. The line of succession, the order showing who inherits the throne next, had to remain clear, protected, and stronger than any private bond. That mattered because the monarchy survives when duty is understood, before emotion is allowed to shape command. It also mattered because the palace had seen what blurred authority could do. One room could divide, one sentence could wound, and one hesitation could become a crisis. The king had stripped Camilla of key internal authority and elevated William to secure the future direction of the crown. He had acted as monarch first, husband second, and that choice left him with a sadness no statement could hide. Camilla was not erased, but she was changed. The queen consort still had her place, her title, and her public role. Yet the quiet authority she once moved through had been replaced by boundaries she could no longer cross. She understood that the deepest humiliation was not losing everything. It was keeping enough to be seen, while losing enough to know what had truly happened. Charles knew she might never fully forgive him. Camilla knew he had chosen the future king over the comfort of their private peace. William made his final choice with restraint. The prince did not issue a dramatic command. He did not turn Camilla's defeat into a display of strength. Instead, he protected her dignity by keeping decisions written, accountable, and free from private revenge. That restraint revealed what power had already taught him. Authority is not proven by how loudly it speaks, but by how carefully it refuses to wound. Charles had not elevated William because he was weak. He had done it because he finally understood that the future must be prepared before crisis demands it. The verdict is clear. The monarchy chose continuity over comfort, duty over domestic peace, and William over uncertainty. Not as a betrayal, but as the necessary transfer of trust. Charles lost peace inside his own house. Camilla lost the authority she believed was permanent, and William stepped forward not as a rival, but as the future the crown could no longer delay. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.